Today's first reading comes to us from Isaiah, and we are drawing close to, obviously, Holy Week. As a matter of fact, one of the things we're doing this week, the fifth week of Lent, is if you listen carefully at Mass, and the priest is doing as instructed, you will notice the preface is actually for the Passion of the Lord. So the preface, that's our first change as we draw closer to Holy Week and the Triduum. So the preface changes. But we're looking at the first reading, and the first reading, of course, is from, in this case, from Isaiah. And one of the powerful things it's all about is this prediction of ultimately Christmas. And it also tends to be somewhat controversial. So let's talk about this for a second. Well, obviously, that's the reason why I do this segment. Hey, and by the way, let's just talk about this because, that's like, what a coincidence. I wanted to watch the news at 6:30 p.m., and it just so happens I turn on my TV at 6:30 p.m., and there's the news. What a coincidence. So that's what we do here. We talk about the first reading. So in any case, there's a bit of a controversy in it, and let me explain to you why. When you go to church, if you go to church today, or when you look over the reading, you're going to notice something. You actually, if I didn't point it out, you may not have noticed it, but you will now. It's one of those things you can't unhear, is you will hear the reader describe Mary as a young woman pregnant and about to bear a son. Okay? That will be the sign from the Lord. Now, does that sound familiar to you, or are you more used to the more traditional reading, which is as follows? This comes to us, of course, I'm going to read from the Catholic Public Domain version. This comes to us from verse 14 of chapter 7, which is the same verse I just read, but that's in the New American Bible Revised Edition. For this reason, the Lord himself will grant you a sign. Behold, a virgin will conceive, and she will give birth to a son, and his name will be Emmanuel. What is the version you hear? What is it you're going to hear at Mass today? The young woman, pregnant and about to bear a son. Those two I hate that translation. I hate that. No, now that I think about it, I think I do believe I have Mass at the chapel on Wednesday. Maybe I will just change the translation, which is going to get the Confraternity of Christian Doctrine down in Washington going, what? He can't do that. So maybe I won't, just not to upset them. But I hate that translation, because it's completely different than what we understand and completely different than the message. It comes from the same Greek words, but they're two different translations. And what are we seeing? The virgin will be with child, and she will bear a son, and who will be named Emmanuel. That's the version I prefer because that's the whole point. The whole point of Mary giving birth is not that she is a pregnant young woman, that she is a virgin who is bearing a son. That is the whole point. And this is the message, and this is why I don't like, there are several passages in the New American Bible Revised Edition that I just don't like. One of my favorite examples, this is not from the New American Bible, but favorite examples of bad translations, is I was at a Jesuit retreat house. I think this was for my deacon retreat. And, everything was politically correct and all the other stuff. And they said, how do they put it? Oh, they referred to not the fishermen, but the fisher persons. Well, here's the problem. I can understand that, but you can call people fisher persons today down in Gloucester, which is on the other side of the state from where I am, or down in Fall River, which is about 25 minutes south of me. But you can't call them fisher persons in the Bible because they weren't fisher persons. They were fishermen, because that's the way the structure was set up. It's not something to change to make it politically correct, because you want to be historically accurate. And so they would call them the fisher persons at the Jesuit retreat house. And I'm like, they weren't fisher persons. They were fishermen. That's just the way it was. That's always the way it was at that time. Today, like I said, there are fisher persons, but not then. So we look at this understanding and we see this translation of the young woman who is pregnant to a bear, and I go, no. I hate that translation because it misses the whole point of the message. And this is why I hate it. Now, again, the Douay-Rheims is virgin shall be with child. As a matter of fact, if I'm not wrong, that's also the Charlie Brown version, the Douay-Rheims. So we want to understand that, and we want to be careful how we translate things, that we don't translate the faith right out of the Bible. This is one of the issues that they taught us in the seminary. It's called the historical critical method, and it takes a look at the original writings and tries to come to understand how it was originally written. And you're looking in context, you're looking at the history, you're looking at what is known as hermeneutics, which is studying the original text in light of the world surrounding it. And so somehow they came up with the translation of the young woman shall be pregnant. And I'm like, no, that does not make any sense. And this is an important distinction. So when you are reading the Bible, this is why versions are important. But when you are reading the Bible, you want to understand that the translations are exactly that. They're just translations. If you want to know what it actually says, you have to go to the original documents. Now, I do a very, technical way of doing it, which is probably not very accurate, but it's a technical way of doing it, is I will go to the original Latin, and through the original Latin, I will find the original Greek. And that gets me there enough. Nothing that I would consider myself an expert by any stretch of the imagination. But at least I can look to say, well, what does the original Greek say, as best that I can determine, and then beyond that, I'd have to go look at some very good manuals, and not manuals, but books and studies and everything else. But that's why it's important to understand not just the Bible, but the original language. Now, the average person doesn't have the time to do that, but it's also time to look at, when you see something, do I agree with this translation? In this case, absolutely I don't. Sorry, I don't. Don't like it the whole bit, any more than I agreed with the Jesuits using the term fisher persons. Doesn't make any sense. There were no fisher persons in the time of Jesus. They were fishermen. It's important. There are fisher persons in Gloucester. There are fisher persons in Fall River. There are fisher persons in San Diego. In I've never been to this part of Europe. The only part of Europe I've been to Rome. So there are fisher persons in the fishing villages along the French Riviera, along the Mediterranean, along the east coast of the Atlantic, the east coast of South America. Yes, there are fisher persons today, but they weren't then. So in the same way, it's okay when you read a translation to say, I don't agree with that translation. It's not okay to say, I don't agree with the original Greek, because that's the original Greek. But not that many people can do that, because obviously you have to know Greek. But when you see a translation, you can say, I don't agree with that. That is not what I believe was originally written. And certainly it wasn't, because that is the sign. The virgin shall be with child. You know, the fact that Mary was a young woman and pregnant means nothing. There is a element to it that we can see in the story of Matthew. But the fact that Mary was a young woman and pregnant means nothing. The key was that she was a young woman and pregnant and a virgin, because this is the thing. It is according to our faith that the Holy Spirit overshadowed her. The true father of Jesus is the Holy Spirit. Now, it is true that this story, which we heard last week on March 19th, it was something that Joseph did not believe right away. So, no, that doesn't make any sense. And then he had to learn in a dream that, in fact, it was true. And it does make sense when we understand who Jesus was. But if you turn around and say, I don't like these modern translations, that's okay. Remember, that's the copyrighted version. Go have yourself a lot of fun with the copyrighted version. But you can turn around and say, no, I don't accept that. I like the more traditional version. That's okay. We'll be back right after this. You're listening to the Catholic Audio Media Podcast. Did you know that the Catholic Audio Media Podcast is available on various podcast platforms? You can find us, among others, on Podbean, which is our home platform. You can find it on Spotify, Amazon Music, iHeart, among others. Just look for Catholic Audio Media, all one word. On some platforms, such as Spotify, look for Catholic Audio Media, 3 words, and subscribe and listen to the Catholic Audio Media Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Patreon. Patreon.com/Catholic Audio Media. Patreon.com/Catholic Audio Media. Check us out. Check what we have to offer. Previews of upcoming podcasts. Previews of upcoming columns over at catholicaudiomedia.substack.com. Your ability to comment, make suggestions, even make suggestions in upcoming programs. Check us out. Patreon.com, Catholic Audio Media. So there was an interesting Substack came out from none other than Alan Dershowitz. And of course, as you may or may not know, I think he's emeritus right now, but Alan Dershowitz has a very strong Massachusetts connection. I don't know if he's originally from Massachusetts, but obviously he was a professor at Harvard Law School for decades, I believe. And of course, he's very well known. He used to summer, maybe still does. Well, I guess he does. On Martha's Vineyard, a place I've never been to, by the way, even though I'm from Massachusetts and live in Massachusetts even to this very day. With just 6 years when I was in the Navy, I was outside of the state. So anyway, he lives on Martha's Vineyard. Well, he tells the story. If you know about Alan Dershowitz, that he represented President Trump in some of the trials that he was dealing with. And because of that, he's become a pariah in some of his social circles. And the interesting thing he brings out, he used to be good friends with the Henrys, who are the couple that own, well, obviously the married couple, that own the Red Sox and, by the way, the Boston Globe. It's kind of an interesting thought for me that he has to bring out. And that is that they used to invite him all the time to to Red Sox games, or at least opening day, and he'd sit in their. Obviously, they have one of the skyboxes that are there at Fenway Park. I mean, let's be honest. Fenway Park is just a shrine, as some of the locals call it, and when you realize, you have all over the country, you have ballparks, but few of them are as iconic as Fenway. And I do believe, and in this case, I disagree with George Will, who said that the oldest park in baseball was it Wrigley Field? Is it? Anyway, it's in Chicago. And I disagree. I think the oldest park in baseball is Fenway. And of course, obviously, I'm partial to Fenway. I grew up in Boston. I grew up in a town called Weymouth, Massachusetts, which is on the other side. Just to show you how close we are. Weymouth, the next town over on our shoreline is Quincy, Massachusetts, and the next town from there, or city or whatever, municipality, is Boston. So I grew up close to Boston. Fenway Park's on the other side of the city, but it's still in Boston. It's not that far. And Fenway Park, of course, is considered the shrine. You have to realize that when you're talking Fenway, you're talking people like Babe Ruth played there. I mean, you can talk about Ted Williams, who played in the 50s, and everyone thinks he was this great hero and everything else. And I never saw Ted Williams play, but you have to remember Babe Ruth played there. He pitched in Fenway Park, and if you know the story of why Babe Ruth ended up in New York for the Yankees is because the owner of the Red Sox was also a theater producer, and he produced a show that bombed. It was called No No Nanette, which is still around today. You can see it occasionally, and it bombed. And because of that, to pay off debts, he had to sell the Red Sox. No, he had to sell, not the Red Sox. He had to sell Babe Ruth. Sold him to New York. So that became what was known as the Curse of the Bambino. With the Red Sox, this was right after they won the World Series in 1918, and they didn't win another World Series for the rest of the 20th century. They didn't win again until, I think, 2004, if I'm not wrong. So that's the history of the Red Sox. And that was when they were owned through most of the 20th century by the Yankees. And ultimately, the Yankees died, and they sold it to the Henrys. And the Henrys, in the meantime, also bought the Boston Globe. So there's the story, and they were very good friends with Alan Dershowitz, but ever since he represented President Trump, his whole circle rejects him, he's saying, and the Henrys, according to him, now remember, this isn't my account, this is his account, never invited him again once he started representing President Trump, which at that time would have been former President Trump. And once he started representing him, his whole social circle turned on him. But he makes a good point. And he also makes a point that I disagree with. So you can find this on his Substack. And his Substack, just so you know, is substack.com/@ DERSH, which probably is his nickname, Dersh. And it's entitled, bring you to his notes page, Substack notes, and it is entitled, Why I Will Not Be at Fenway Opening Day. So, in any case, he explains how he's never been invited back because he represented President Trump. Now, he makes an interesting point, which is so important. Our judicial system works when you have people representing even the worst of all criminals. Always remember that our freedoms are defined in the extremes, not in the means. Because if you ensure, and I'm not comparing this to President Trump, I'm just making this a statement. If you ensure that every single person has a lawyer to represent them in one way or another, then you are sure that our judicial system works, providing the lawyer does all he can to get the person the proper justice. Okay? You can be assured that our judicial system works. If you don't ensure that, regardless of who is being represented, then you have a limit to your judicial system. And it's not going to work in the long run. Then you end up in the show trials that happened in the Soviet Union. You never want to be down that path. So he is absolutely right. Regardless of who he represented, in this case, President Trump, he needed, you have to have someone representing every single person who seeks legal representation. So apparently, according to him, I'm not saying this is something I know, but according to him, he is saying that he has never since been invited to join the Henrys. Now, one of the things I disagree with him is that he won't go see the Red Sox, but I would turn around and say, so what? Go see the Red Sox. Now, I have that experience myself because the Henrys also bought the Boston Globe. They bought it from the New York Times. They bought it for a song. As a matter of fact, I think the New York Times, if you really look at the price of what they bought the Boston Globe and its building and what they sold it as, it really looks like that they sold the building and gave them the newspaper for free. The big building that used to be on Morrissey Boulevard. They sold the building to the Henrys and gave them the newspaper for free. That's literally what it looks like. Now, as you know, I used to work for the original Boston Globe, the one that I have respect for. I don't like, have not, and never will, the current Boston Globe, regardless of who owns it, because it's not the one owned by the Taylors, unless the Taylors decide to buy it back. That's the one I work for. That's the one my father worked for. That's the one I consider a prestigious newspaper. So, but the reason why I say that is because I would still go see the Red Sox. The Red Sox, even though when you're going to see the Red Sox, you're seeing, if not a sister organization to the Boston Globe, but so what? The Red Sox are the Red Sox, and I'd go see them. So, like, if the Henrys, who wouldn't invite me, they don't even know me, Henrys, regardless of who would invite me, I would go because it's the Red Sox. Now, understand God's mercy works the same way. That's why it's important for you to realize that God's mercy has no limit. Because if there is any kind of a limit in God's mercy, and the only people he won't forgive are people who reject his forgiveness. If there is a limit to God's mercy, then you have no idea if he has mercy on you. So that works exactly the same way. So that's why I agree with Alan Dershowitz on the fact that every person needs legal representation, but I disagree with him on not going to see the Red Sox. I'd say go anyway, sit in wherever, and I think that's where I would be for the same reason. That's what it stands for, in that you're saying, I love the Red Sox and I will still do what I do because on the same way he's standing up for a principle. Similarly, we always want God's mercy for all. Otherwise, we have no idea if there's God's mercy for us. We'll be right back right after this. You can now leave a message for us, which we can air and discuss on this program. Just call 617-297-7452. That's 617-297-7452. 617-297-7452. Feel free to call, leave a comment, a question, or even feedback, and we may play it on the air. I can discuss your comment or question as well, so give that a try. 617-297-7452, 617-297-7452. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Patreon. Patreon.com/Catholic Audio Media. Patreon.com/Catholic Audio Media. Check us out. Check what we have to offer. Previews of upcoming podcasts. Previews of upcoming columns over at CatholicAudiomedia.substack.com. Your ability to comment, make suggestions, even make suggestions in upcoming programs. Check us out. Patreon.com, Catholic Audio Media.
Yeah, you know the real is back. Father Carl Chaplain from the city of champions, dropping daily reflections coming straight from the field. The raw truth revealed for the strong-willed. It's the Greatest Act of Defiance podcast with your host, Father Carl, a message built to last. The Greatest Act of Defiance podcast. That's right, the Greatest Act of Defiance. Word up. Word up. Word up.
The The Catholic teaching in this podcast is reflected and presented as accurately as possible. The opinions expressed are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the Archdiocese of Boston or any other institution.